The sun was just beginning to rise over the arid hills of Midian, casting an orange glow across the vast expanse of the Israelite camp. Gideon, a young man from the tribe of Manasseh, stood at the edge of the encampment, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The Israelites had suffered under the oppressive rule of the Midianites for 7 long years, and now, with God's guidance, Gideon had been chosen to lead his people to victory. Gideon had initially doubted his ability to lead the Israelites, but after seeing the miraculous signs God had performed, he knew that the Lord was with him. Now, as he gazed out at the vast army of Midianites that had gathered in the valley, he couldn't help but feel a sense of overwhelming inadequacy. How could he and his small band of men possibly defeat such a formidable foe? But Gideon had learned to trust in the Lord's plan, and he knew that the size of his army was not what mattered. What mattered was their faith and their willingness to follow God's commands. And so, with a deep breath, Gideon gathered his men and prepared to put their faith to the test. The Israelites had been hiding in the hills, waiting for the right moment to strike. As the Midianites settled in for the night, Gideon and his 300 men crept silently down the slopes, each man carrying a trumpet, a clay jar, and a torch. They divided into 3 groups and surrounded the Midianite camp, waiting for Gideon's signal. At the appointed time, Gideon raised his hand, and the men shattered their jars, revealing the torches within. The sudden flash of light and the blaring of the trumpets caught the Midianites off guard, and they were thrown into a state of panic and confusion. In the chaos that followed, the Midianites began to turn on one another, each man's sword raised against his neighbor. Gideon and his men watched in amazement as the mighty Midianite army was routed, fleeing in terror before the Lord. As the dust settled, Gideon and his men surveyed the scene, scarcely able to believe what had just happened. They had not even drawn their own swords, yet the Lord had delivered the Midianites into their hands. It was a miraculous victory, one that would be remembered for generations to come. But the story of Gideon's victory over the Midianites is more than just a tale of military might. It is a story of faith, humility, and the power of God to work through the weak and the unexpected. Gideon was not a seasoned warrior, nor was he a powerful leader. He was a simple farmer, called by God to do the impossible. Throughout the story, Gideon is depicted as a man who is constantly seeking reassurance and confirmation from God. He asks for signs, he doubts his own abilities, and he even questions whether God has truly chosen him for this task. But through it all, God remains patient and faithful, guiding Gideon and strengthening his faith. One of the most striking aspects of the story is the way in which God whittles down Gideon's army, from 32,000 men to just 300. This is not because God is looking for the strongest or the most capable soldiers, but because he wants to make it clear that the victory belongs to him alone. As Gideon himself says, "The Lord has delivered Midian into your hands." The lesson here is clear: God does not need our strength or our numbers to accomplish his will. He simply requires our obedience and our willingness to trust in him. And when we do, he is able to work through us in ways that defy all human logic and expectation. This is a message that is just as relevant today as it was in Gideon's time. In a world that values power, wealth, and status, it can be easy to forget that God's ways are often the opposite of ours. He chooses the weak to shame the strong, the foolish to confound the wise, and the small to overcome the mighty. And so, as we consider the story of Gideon and his 300 soldiers, let us be reminded of the power of faith, the importance of obedience, and the incredible things that can happen when we surrender our lives to God's plan. For when we do, we may just find ourselves part of a miracle that defies all human understanding. The story of Gideon's victory over the Midianites is found in the book of Judges, chapters 6 to 8. It begins with the Israelites once again turning away from God and falling under the oppressive rule of the Midianites. The Midianites would raid the Israelite camps, destroying their crops and livestock, and leaving the people in a state of poverty and despair. In the midst of this bleak situation, God appears to Gideon, a young man from the tribe of Manasseh, and calls him to be the one who will deliver the Israelites from the Midianite oppression. Gideon, like many of us, is hesitant and doubtful, questioning whether God has truly chosen him for this task. But God is patient and reassuring, performing a series of miraculous signs to confirm Gideon's calling. First, Gideon asks for a sign, and God causes a fire to consume the offering Gideon has placed on a rock. Then, Gideon asks for another sign, and God causes the fleece he has laid out to be wet with dew while the ground around it remains dry. With these signs, Gideon's faith begins to grow, and he sets out to gather an army to fight the Midianites. But God has a plan that will make it clear that the victory belongs to him alone. He instructs Gideon to send home all but 300 of his 32,000 men, and then he tells Gideon to arm his men with nothing but trumpets, jars, and torches. The stage is now set for the climactic battle, and Gideon and his 300 men approach the Midianite camp under the cover of night. At the appointed time, they shatter their jars, revealing the torches within, and they blow their trumpets, creating a mighty din that fills the night air. The Midianites, caught off guard and thrown into a state of panic and confusion, begin to turn on one another, each man's sword raised against his neighbor. Gideon and his men watch in amazement as the mighty Midianite army is routed, fleeing in terror before the Lord. It is a stunning victory, one that defies all human logic and expectation. The 300 men of Gideon's army do not even draw their own swords, yet they are able to defeat a vastly superior force simply by following God's instructions. The story of Gideon's victory over the Midianites is a powerful testament to the power of faith and obedience. Gideon, a humble and doubting man, is transformed into a courageous leader who is willing to trust in God's plan, even when it seems impossible. And it is this lesson of faith and obedience that continues to resonate with us today. In a world that often values power, wealth, and status, the story of Gideon and his 300 soldiers reminds us that God's ways are often the opposite of ours. He chooses the weak to shame the strong, the foolish to confound the wise, and the small to overcome the mighty. As we reflect on this story, we are challenged to examine our own lives and our own relationship with God. Are we willing to trust in His plan, even when it doesn't make sense to us? Are we willing to step out in faith, even when we are filled with doubt and uncertainty? The answer, of course, is not always easy. Like Gideon, we may find ourselves constantly seeking reassurance and confirmation from God. We may question our abilities, we may doubt our calling, and we may even struggle to believe that God can work through us. But the message of Gideon's story is clear: God does not need our strength or our numbers to accomplish His will. He simply requires our obedience and our willingness to trust in Him. And when we do, He is able to work through us in ways that defy all human logic and expectation. So, as we consider the story of Gideon and his 300 soldiers, let us be inspired to step out in faith, to trust in God's plan, and to allow Him to work through us in ways that we could never have imagined. For when we do, we may just find ourselves part of a miracle that defies all human understanding. In the end, the story of Gideon's victory over the Midianites is a powerful reminder that God's ways are not our ways, and that His strength is made perfect in our weakness. It is a story that challenges us to let go of our own assumptions and preconceptions, and to embrace the unexpected ways in which God chooses to work in our lives. And as we reflect on this story, we are reminded that the God who delivered the Midianites into the hands of Gideon's small army is the same God who is at work in our lives today. He is a God of power and might, but also a God of grace and mercy, who is willing to use the weak and the unexpected to accomplish His purposes. So, let us take courage from the story of Gideon and his 300 soldiers, and let us be inspired to walk in faith, to trust in God's plan, and to allow Him to work through us in ways that defy all human logic and expectation. For when we do, we may just find ourselves part of a miracle that changes the course of history.